gente vai ter início agora a palestra do professor Laurent, que é também um dos organizadores da exposição sobre a vida do matemático Borel, está ali no saguão. A gente vai abrir a exposição após a palestra. Queria agradecer bastante Silvia e Luciana por terem feito esse evento aqui no IMEC, por terem organizado esse aqui no IMEC. Silvia está lembrando que eu roubei esse evento da Biblioteca Central, ia ser lá, mas eu acho que fazia muito pouco sentido uma exposição sobre o Borel não ser no IMEC, uma palestra sobre o Borel não ser no IMEC. Então, eu agradeço muito elas por terem aceitado trazer o evento para cá. E, bom, vou passar para a Luciana para ela fazer a introdução do Laurent e dar início à palestra.
Bom, antes de mais nada, eu queria agradecer a todo mundo pela presença. É um grande prazer para a gente estar aqui nessa abertura, nessa conferência que marca a abertura, então, da exposição, que vai ficar durante o mês de setembro disponível aqui no IMEC. E agradecer, primeiramente, ao professor Laurent Mazliak, que ele veio para o Brasil em uma missão no INPA, no Rio de Janeiro, e ele me convidou para fazer a tradução dessa exposição. Então, todos os erros em português, a culpa é minha, mas os autores da exposição não têm culpa. Ela foi feita originalmente em francês, no Instituto Henri Poincaré, na Sorbonne Université. E agradecer também a professora Silvia Figueiredo, que é minha supervisora de pós-doutorado, por toda a ajuda. Sem ela, nada disso teria sido possível. E ao professor Ricardo, por ter acolhido na conferência e a exposição e por todo o suporte aqui no IMEC. O professor Laurent Mazliak, ele é matemático, historiador da matemática, especialista, então, na obra e na trajetória do Émile Borel, e professor lá na Sorbonne Université em Paris. E então hoje ele vai falar para a gente sobre The Mathematics of Émile Borel in the Transition between the 19th and 20th Century. Muito obrigada, merci beaucoup, professor Laurent. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Sorry not to speak Portuguese, so I use English, the lingua franca. So thank you very much to the organizers, and particularly to Sonia and to Silvia and Luciana for the presentation of the exhibition here. I'm very glad it can be presented here in Campinas. It was presented in Rio at the beginning of the week. And also because this event, of this exhibition and this presentation give me the opportunity to come back to Brazil after 30 years in fact. So it's a good occasion. Let me first say that this exhibition was conceived and presented for the first time at the Institut Henri Poincaré in Paris. It was conceived for the Institute, presented in 2021. And I prepared this exhibition. We were 6 historians of mathematics and physics preparing the panels for the exhibition. They are my colleagues here. Now, the aim of the talk I'm about to give today can be briefly described as follows. To find in Émile Borel, a mathematician of great stature, on the one hand, the heritage of the great mathematical analysis developed in France at the beginning of the 19th century and of the current of function theory he had discovered in his German reading. And on the other hand, the desire for social commitment typical of a current of French intellectuals at the end of the 19th century, which was to take a great political importance in the first half of the 20th century. So to understand how Borel has built his scientific career, it is necessary to go back in time and briefly explain the academic situation in which he was immersed during his studies. And to a large extent, so I will go back quite a lot in the past, to a large extent, the situation was a direct result of the institutions created by the French Revolution and the Empire. The creation, in particular, of the Grandes Écoles was intended to train a new technocracy responsible for reorganizing the country based on centralized management dictated from Paris. First and foremost, it was a question of regional planning. roads, bridges, ports, mines, and so on. And this shaped the training of the scientific elite for many years to come. France's current system is still strongly influenced by what was set up at the time. The flagship of this school was the École Polytechnique. Less prestigious but important in consolidating the edifice, the École Normale Supérieure was there to train the teachers who would be responsible for guiding promising young people toward the preparation for the grandes écoles. In all these schools, or at least as a prerequisite for entry, mathematics was given the lion's share of attention. The reasons for this are manifold and naturally stem from the importance the discipline took on in the 18th century as a means of tackling the fundamental physics problems that were being studied at the time. Vibrating strings, hydraulics, and so on. Big physical problems in the 18th century. In the spirit of the Enlightenment, which largely dictated the construction of the French educational system, science was first and foremost mathematized. To this must be added Bonaparte's real taste for mathematics, which he had practiced to some extent, and in any case for the mathematicians who at the time were swirling around power as rarely as at any other time in history. Bonaparte had taken a cohort of scientists, including for instance Monge and the young Fourier, on the expedition to Egypt in 1798. And although the expedition was a military disaster, it did cement Bonaparte's ties with the academic world. After his coup d'etat of 1799, many mathematicians were appointed to political positions, and above all, to academic posts. Laplace was appointed Minister of the Interior, Fourier was appointed Prefect, several mathematicians were appointed senators. One name stands out as emblematic among the mathematicians created by this new situation in France. His name is Cauchy, undoubtedly the most influential French mathematician of the mid-19th century. It's ironic that this man, who professed profoundly monarchical and anti-revolutionary political views all his life, to the point of going into exile when King Charles X was overthrown during the 1830 revolution, should appear as a pure product of the institution of the revolution and the empire. As if by provocation, as you see, he was actually born in 1789. Appointed professor at the École Polytechnique, Cauchy was faced with the challenge of math teaching, which required streamlined definitions and statements. He wrote a cours d'analyse, which became the matrix for modern mathematics courses, the legacy of which we still live with today. Cauchy felt the need to present clearly and indisputably the fundamental notions of analysis, such as the convergence of sequences and series, simple and multiple integrals, and so on. If the impossible nature of the man alienated many of his contemporaries, members of the younger generations were not mistaken about the importance of the task accomplished. And it's not exaggeration to say that the whole of the 19th century learned to do analysis from Cauchy. Witness this sentence taken from a letter from Abel to one of his friends. Abel was Norwegian and came to Paris to follow mathematical lectures, suffered greatly from the ostracism of the French towards him. And he wrote to his friend, "Cauchy is crazy, but only he knows how to do mathematics." As a result, Cauchy was to become a kind of unsurpassable model, which somewhat sclerotized analysis in France. There was in fact a passing of the baton between France and Germany, with Dirichlet playing a key role. Dirichlet, who had spent a long time in Paris in the 1820s and studied with Fourier, Cauchy, Laplace, and so on, exported the French way of doing analysis to Germany. Strongly influenced by Fourier, he began studying trigonometric series. From 1829 onwards, Dirichlet was in Berlin, where he established a lively center for the leading German mathematicians of the mid-19th century. To name but one of the most dazzlingly intuitive mathematicians of all time came out of this school. I mean, Riemann. He took up Cauchy's concept of the integral, for example, but went far beyond it by seeking to specify the general nature of functions susceptible to integration, inaugurating studies on the structure of sets of singularities extended by Heine, Dubois-Reymond and Cantor. In a sense, even if Riemann's practice tended to emphasize intuitive reasoning, Hilbert's axiomatic formalism is also an heir of Riemann. It's also worth recalling Riemann's major role in the emergence of Italian mathematicians on the international scene. A famous visit to Riemann by Brioschi, Casorati and in 1858, closely followed by his departure, Riemann's departure for Italy for health reasons, and he died in Italy in 1866. You have the writer, Riemann's grave, in Verbana, just along the Lago di Como. So his coming to Italy gave the Italians the opportunity to familiarize themselves with German mathematics and to embody a genuine new generation of mathematicians with important works that marked milestones in differential geometry and the study of function of one real variable. This was particularly true of Ulisse Dini, who became also interested in Cantor's work on sets and topology. Dini published a major treatise on the theory of functions of the real variable in 1878. Dazzled, Georg Cantor immediately had it translated into German. Dini's pupil, Vito Volterra, followed in his footsteps and at a very young age produced important studies on the properties of derivative in the early 1880s. Somewhat convinced of its superiority, France has remained aloof from the movement of ideas that was profoundly transforming the nature of mathematics at mid-century. And it was an unexpected event that suddenly made people realize, intellectuals, realize that the lines had moved. The 1870 war with Prussia ended in a disastrous defeat and was deeply traumatic. The backwardness of French science was forcefully underlined, notably by scientists like Pasteur, who took particular aim at the École Polytechnique and the catastrophic way in which it was, in their view, driving the most creative forces away from living scientific research and confining them to engineering and production. By contrast, the École Normale became the emblematic site of pure scientific creation in France. Among mathematicians, Gaston Darboux was the driving force behind this new awareness. In correspondence with Jules Rouel, with whom he had founded the Bulletin des Sciences Mathématiques et Astronomiques, a journal which still exists today, a great journal of mathematics in the world, in 1869, Darboux wrote the following: "We need to overhaul our higher education. The Germans are outnumbering us here and elsewhere. I believe that if this continues, the Italians will soon overtake us. So let's use our bulletin to reawaken this sacred fire and make the French understand that there are a lot of things in the world they don't realize, and that if we're still the great nation," you see here in French, just ironically, it was a grand nation, irony, if we're still the great nation, it's hardly noticed abroad. Logically enough, Darboux's first duty was to make the work of certain German mathematicians known in France. First and foremost, Riemann, for whom he published several translations in the Bulletin in the 1870s. In 1873, for example, he offered a translation of Riemann's habilitation on trigonometric series. A little later, the mathematician and philosopher Gaston Milhaud similarly translated Dubois-Reymond's treatise on functions. Borel precisely was born in 1871. Encouraged by Darboux, whose son was one of his fellow students, he entered the École Normale in 1889, right in the middle of the revival years. He was a passionate reader of Dubois-Reymond and Cantor. The 1890s were a time of creative explosion for Borel, who published a steady stream of important articles, laying the foundations for a profound transformation of function theory. In 1894, he defended a PhD, a thesis, on analytic extensions, in which he introduced for the first time the idea of a theory of measure of sets. A few years later, Lebesgue used this construction as the basis for his new approach to integration. In his thesis, Borel introduced an original way of using a countable additivity property for the length of sets, seen as a direct extension to infinity of the finite case, thereby outlining a vision of mathematics that would later be described, somewhat ironically, as semi-intuitionism. Neither radical axiomatism nor complete constructivism. Although Borel was initially an enthusiastic disciple of Cantor, see how in his PhD he used cardinality arguments to prove results, here to prove the Borel-Lebesgue covering result, the compactness of the segment 01. He gradually turned away from the purely logical path that led to Hilbert's axiomatism, for which logical consistency is a sufficient assertion of existence. Borel's growing preoccupation with the practical value of mathematical knowledge led him to consider that mathematics of practical use is that which manipulates objects that can actually be constructed. From then on, Borel became a tireless advocate of the value of approximate knowledge. This was particularly true in the early years of the 20th century, when debates on foundations, such as the questioning of Zermelo's axiom of choice, raged. Borel paid particular attention to the structure of real numbers and their approximation, either decimal or using continued fractions. To better understand how Borel's conception of the measure of sets influenced his approach to the structure of real numbers, it's interesting to take a closer look at an article he published in 1903, devoted to what he called the arithmetic analysis of the continuum. In it, Borel explained that there are two profoundly different ways of filling in the continuum, and illustrates them with a simple example. Let's suppose, says Borel, that we have n plus 1 points in the interval 0n, different from the integers 0, 1, 2, n. On the figure we take n equals 5. In this case, there must be 2 points at a distance strictly less than 1. Indeed, dividing 0n into n interval 0, 1, 1, 2, n minus 1, n, Dirichlet's principle of drawers allows us to assert that one of the intervals contains at least 2 points. But there is another way of proceeding. Let's call x1, x2, xn plus 1 the n plus 1 points. Consider the n plus 1 intervals, ki here, xi minus 1/2, xi plus 1/2. The total length of this interval is n plus 1, and their union is clearly included in the set I here, minus 1/2 n plus 1/2, which is of length n plus 1. This means that 2 of the intervals under consideration must necessarily meet, because if it was not the case, the total length of the Ki should have to be strictly less than that of A, since there would be some interval point of A outside the meeting of the Ki. let's say that ki and kj meet, then xi and xj are less than 1 apart. The difference between the two proofs is obvious. In the first one, we take a subdivision which is independent of the xi, whereas the interval in the second approach are placed according to the points xy. And the separation of the 2 points of view becomes radical when the number of points is infinite. Suppose, for example, that we look at the sequence xn of rational numbers in the interval 0, 1. If we subdivide the interval into a fixed partition, however small the elements of the partition might be, the union of intervals containing rationals will invariably be of length 1, because the rationals are dense in the real. Whereas, if around each xi we consider an interval xi minus epsilon over 2 to the power I, the total length of interval containing rationals will be less than epsilon, and can therefore be made as small as we like. This is obviously the proof that the rationals are zero, measure 0, Lebesgue measure 0 in 0, 1. And this demonstration, typical of measure theoretic reasoning, is seen by Borel as filling the interval 0, 1 from the inside, in the sense that he shows that the rationals are not sufficient to fill the segment 0, 1 to its full length. 1905 was a pivotal year in Borel's career, when several trends converged to usher in a new phase. First, there was a mathematical surprise, at first sight rather superficial. In an article by the Swedish mathematician Anders Wiman on problems involving continued fractions, Borel discovered that the measure of sets and Lebesgue's integral, which was very new at the time. Lebesgue's integral was published for the first time in 1901, and this discovering of the Wiman's article is from 1904. He discovered, Borel, in this article, that the measure of set and Lebesgue's integral were well suited to answering questions posed in the form of probabilities. In fact, there's an intuitive way of understanding that the set of rationals is of measure 0 in 0, 1. Imagine the experiment of drawing a real number at random between 0 and 1 and asserting that the probability of it being a rational number is equal to 0. It is that this event is practically impossible. A second source for Borel's interest in probability in 1905 was the quick development of statistical physics. Borel published a paper in which he showed how this probabilistic use gave a precise mathematical foundation to the kinetic theory of gases, thus obtained the Maxwell-Boltzmann law of velocities. The comment he made at the beginning of his article illustrates his vision of the expected developments. He wrote, "I'd like to address all those who, on the subject of the kinetic theory of gases, share Bertrand's opinion that probability problems are similar to the problem of finding the captain's age when the height of the mainmast is known. If their scruples are justified up to a point, because a mathematician cannot be reproached for his love of rigor, it does not seem impossible to satisfy them. That's the purpose of the following pages. They don't really advance a theory from a physical point of view, but they may convince several mathematicians of its interest, and, by increasing the number of researchers, indirectly contribute to its development. If this is the case, they will not have been useless, independently of the aesthetic interest present in any logical construction." This same year, 1905, saw Borel's social commitment on a grand scale, resulting in an important act, the creation, together with his wife, of a monthly journal, the Revue du Mois. Borel belonged to a caste of radical left-wing intellectuals who had received their political education in the turmoil of the Dreyfus affair. Their anti-clerical and anti-nationalist stances convinced them of the need for citizen action to promote rationalism and its natural expression, science. Thus, for 10 years, the Revue du Mois was to be a forum for the most important intellectual debates, featuring the most prominent French and sometimes foreign scientists. In the journal preamble, Borel described his goal as follows. The number and importance of questions that can be dealt with by the scientific methods are increasing every day. It seems to us that we can conceive a publication in which this method would be the principal, a publication having nothing especially technical and taking as its essential aim to contribute to the development of general ideas through the exposition and critical study of the progress made in the knowledge of facts and the movement of ideas which are their consequence. The first issue of the Revue du Mois came out in January 1906 and was inaugurated by an article by the Italian mathematician Vittor Volterra. In fact, a translation of the Prolusione he delivered on his appointment to the University of Rome in 1901. In this speech, Volterra wanted to highlight the new fields in which mathematical techniques are set to play a major role. Probability theory does not occupy a large part of the speech, but the passages that do concern it are significant, evoking Quetelet and sociology, or Galton and biometry. Volterra presents probability as one of the most promising areas of mathematics. He writes, "This is the most peculiar and curious branch of mathematics. If we analyze any judgment of our mind, we will always find in it, more or less concealed, a calculation of probability. To a certain extent, it could be said that the simplest man who waits for the sun to rise in the morning owes his faith in daylight to an unconscious application of Bernoulli's law of large numbers." Borel seems to have discovered these new applications while reading Voltaire. The calculus of probability as a tool for quantitative measurement in the service of society was to become a central point of Borel's conception of mathematics. In the Revue du Mois, the theme of measuring chance, risk and prediction was to appear frequently in Borel's writings. It is the practical value of probabilities, the title of Borel's first article in the journal in 1906, that Borel wishes to highlight, not least because the quantification of chance is one of the techniques most likely to make citizens aware that they are participating in society. Borel seeks to understand why the calculus of probability offends the sensibilities of many of his contemporaries, and to make it clear that this antipathy is largely based on a misunderstanding. It would be desirable, writes Borel, for this misunderstanding to be dispelled, because the popularization of the conclusions, if not the methods, of this branch of science is of great social utility. According to Borel, the problem with statistical processing of human data is that it essentially ignores individual particularities and considers only the masses. And yet, each of us is particularly attached to everything that makes up his or her individuality, and thus participates to a greater or lesser extent in that individualistic sensibility that has sometimes been pointed as out as the prerogative of a few elite minds. Man does not like, he writes, to be counted only as a unit in a group, without being individually designated. This is one reason why statistics is not popular. What's more, the calculus of probability derives its scientific value from making predictions that offend the primary psychological sense of human freedom. But if calculation cannot protect against risk and misfortune, if statistics or calculation cannot provide arguments to console those who suffer from social inequalities, the value of statistics and calculation is invaluable in interpreting these injustices, and consequently in guiding action to try to correct them. We must not, writes Borel, seek in them either moral arguments or immediate reasons for action, but only, as in the physical sciences, a means of knowing past events well and predicting future events with a certain degree of approximation. The comparison with physics seems particularly significant. Borel's aim was to gain acceptance for the validity of probabilistic methods in the human sciences, just as he had sought to gain acceptance for the broad outlines of the kinetic theory of gases in his 1906 article. And he doesn't hesitate to attack with irony those who claim to do without their teaching of probability. He writes, "The mathematical answer to many practical questions in a probability is a probability coefficient. Such an answer will not seem satisfactory to many minds which expect certainty from mathematics. This is a very unfortunate tendency, and it is extremely regrettable that public education in this area has made so little progress. This is undoubtedly due to the fact that the calculus of probability is almost universally ignored, even though it is becoming more and more a part of everyone's life. Various types of insurance, mutual funds, pensions, and so on. A probability coefficient is a perfectly clear answer corresponding to an absolutely tangible reality. Some people will maintain that they prefer certainty. They might also prefer 2 and 2 to be 5. Thus, concludes Borel, the calculus of probability and its application to social mathematics are opposed to the most antisocial aspects of a poorly thought out individualism that is nothing other than unintelligent egoism. To defend his vision, Borel occasionally polemicized, notably with the philosopher Henri Bergson, in a controversy over the question of citizen education. In his philosophy of action, Bergson had adopted a critical stance toward intellectuals, defending the idea that an intellectual cut himself off from a natural intelligence that alone could provide him with the tools to adapt to the environment. For Bergson, the education of this natural intelligence could only be achieved through the classical humanities, Greek, Latin, geometry, and geometry meaning Greek geometry, the aim of which was to select an elite of men of action. And that's certainly not of women of action. As one of Bergson's contemporary commentators put it, if we don't want to condemn ourselves to never doing anything, we have to stop basing action on knowledge. Obviously, the quantification of chance, whose aim is to bring average phenomena to the fore, does not sit well with such an elitist conception of life. For Borel, it is precisely by collecting data and processing it statistically that the good sailor can prepare for the storm. The practical value of calculating probabilities means that the most reliable ally for an intelligent and brave attitude in the face of danger is the accumulation of knowledge. Bergson said that instinct should serve as a guide, but for Borel, instinct deceives, and following such a guide would lead to an attitude far less suited to life than training for risk. He sees proofs of this in the fact that we have had to abandon an entirely mechanistic explanation of the universe. The discovery of radioactivity, for example, has shown that statistical reasons must be invoked. For Borel, probability calculus is essentially a social science that stimulates the effects of a decision. This has a lot to do with the fact that probabilities take sets and populations, not individuals, at their basic material. As a result, for Borel, probability theory dominates all the experimental sciences, just as deductive logic dominates mathematical science. For him, probability is the only way to make sense of a collection of data. The value of all experimental science is based on probabilistic result. For Borel, as for all the people of his generation, the outbreak of the First World War was to mark a turning point. Firstly, for him on a personal level, like many of the French mathematicians of the period studied in our book with Rossana Tazzioli, he had to face the death of loved ones, since his adopted son, Fernand, was killed in 1915 in action in Champagne. One of the consequences of the slaughter wrought by the Great War among young French people, and particularly among students, was the great difficulty of renewing the academic community between the wars. In 1915, despite his age of 44, Borel joined the army and soon became involved in the issue of sound-based gun tracking at the front. It became clear from the end of 1914 and the stabilization of the front that major military movements were no longer the order of the day and were being replaced by multiple local offensives prepared by intense artillery bombardment. Locating enemy batteries therefore became a major issue in the war, and various technical means were sought to achieve this. A number of inventors proposed the use of cannon sound recordings at various points to perform a kind of sound triangulation. One of the most famous devices was proposed by physicists Émile Coton and Pierre Weiss, and Borel set out to test it in the field. But for Borel, beyond the strictly military activity, the war played a decisive role in his desire for political involvement and catalyzed his interest in the mathematics of chance. In November 1915, Palvé was another mathematician who entered politics, then Minister of Public Instruction, created the Direction des Inventions intéressant la défense nationale, meaning the Department of Inventions of Interest for National Defense, and put Borel in charge of it. It was at this very moment that Borel was asked to join the board of the Société de Statistique de Paris, Paris Statistical Society, of which he had been a member since 1907. It would be interesting to know what arguments were put forward to bring Borel into this position, but there is no doubt that this proposal had a direct link with the Direction des Inventions. 2 years later, when Palvé became president of the council in 1917, it was to Borel that he entrusted the secretariat of the presidency. If we are to believe Borel's own testimony, and despite the brevity of the experience, Palvé's ministry lasted just 2 months, it was in this capacity that he became aware of the vital importance of organizing the collection and processing of field statistics. In 1920, Borel published his first contribution to the Journal of the Paris Statistical Society in the form of a long article devoted to his experience and proposals for future reorganization. He wrote, "The number and material importance of statistical documents is increasingly daily in all countries, and people become more aware of the importance of having statistics that are sufficiently detailed to be usable for a variety of purposes. Social phenomena are too complex to be captured in oversimplified formulas. Statistics are an indispensable auxiliary for those who assume the onerous task of governing a country. In a few weeks' time, after the government that won the war, France will know the government that will organize the peace. We can confirm that whoever these governments may be, they will need the judicious use of statistics." This experience seems to have inspired Borel to try his hand at politics. He agreed to stand as a radical socialist candidate for several elective offices in his native Aveyron department, south of the Massif Central, the mountain which is the center in France. He became deputy of his hometown, Saint-Afrique, to the French Parliament in 1924. When Palvé became once again president of the French Council in 1925, Borel even agreed to serve as its Minister of the Navy for a few months. Parallel to this entry into national politics, Borel was also a convinced supporter of the new international institution created in the aftermath of the war, such as the League of Nations, in whose work he participated regularly between the wars. He belonged to a class of intellectuals who sought to promote, in a rather visionary way, a long-term European vision as an antidote to the various poisons distilled by the shaky solutions offered by the peace treaties. But it was above all in the use he made of his presence in the corridors of power to influence the creation of new scientific institutions where mathematical studies could develop in line with the philosophy we mentioned earlier. In 1922, Borel presided over the creation of the Institut de Statistique de l'Université de Paris, Paris Institute of Statistics of Paris University. And above all, in 1928, thanks to the abundant funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Institut Henri Poincaré Institute was opened in Paris. From then on, the Institute became one of the world's leading research and teaching centers for mathematical physics and probability. In passing, we should point out that Borel used the Institute to the best of his ability to help his foreign colleagues in the political convulsions of the 1930s Europe. Vito Volterra, for example, was in open conflict with the fascist regime in Italy. And after Hitler came to power in 1933, the number of German refugees invited to lecture at the IHP, the Institute, multiplied. For instance, the statistician Émile Borel. Those whom Borel was never able to invite, despite his incessant attempts as documented in the archives, were the Soviet scientists, confronted with a frontier that was closing ever tired as Stalinist power consolidated. In the 1930s, Moscow was the world's most brilliant center for the calculus of probability, but it is impressive not to find a single Soviet among the invited speakers who actually spoke at the Institute. The only one present, in fact, mathematician Vladimir Alexandrovich Kostitsyn, was only there because at the end of 1928 he had managed to come to Paris as an official guest and did not return to Soviet Union. You can find details if you're interested about that in our study about mathematicians in the Russian immigration in Paris in the 1920s. So in conclusion, we can say that Borel, through the alliance he wished to achieve between the education of citizens through scientific practice and unceasing support for the scientific advances of his time, appears as a model of the committed scientist as dreamt of by the triumphant rationalism of the early 20th century. It's true that this commitment, which could not prevent the world from suffering the catastrophe of the First World War, can be seen in part as a failure. It also makes many scientists, like Borel, question the validity of their worldview. The next generation was not above being critical of them, and some mathematicians in France became staunch defenders of the purity of mathematics, uncompromised by any applications. This is no doubt one of the reasons for the power of the Bourbaki movement in the 1940s. And yet, it seems to me that we should look with some sympathy at how Borel and his fellows devoted their energies with indisputable honesty and courage to the generous ideal they believed in. An example to ponder for our times, which sometimes seem to dangerously doubt the value of any collective construction. So, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Laurent, for this very interesting talk. I will open the mic for if any of you want to do some questions. Nobody? No questions? Vocês podem fazer em português, a gente tenta traduzir também. Well, I have a question. I was wondering, nowadays it's very common to hear about the conflict between the pure sciences, especially in mathematics, but also in the physics in some ways, and this social and political engagement. So when we see, when I translated this exposition, it's very interesting to see this engagement of Borel. So I was wondering, at the same time, it seems not so difficult for him to do this kind of movements. I would like to know if there was some kind of disputes or resistance, especially about this social engagement of mathematics and not only this political involvement. Thank you.
Well, yes, there are many aspects of the question you ask, which led to various types of conflicts. Well, to begin with the thing which is maybe the more obvious, the question. Well, I mentioned at the end that Bourbaki, for instance, is an example of how the next generation contested this use of mathematics for action in society. This is not the only explanation of the Bourbaki movement, but certainly it's part, and in particular because the founders of Bourbaki, they were all born. They were children during the First World War. I mean, so this is a generation which was of people impressed by the First World War, and impressed also not only by the war itself, but also by one consequence of the war. In the 1920s, there was, at least at the beginning of the 1920s, there was a huge ostracism against Germany and German mathematics, for instance. And they just claimed, that the founders of Bourbaki, that they couldn't understand how it was possible to have this ostracism, and they accused this generation, Borel's generation, and all these people who were involved in the war effort to be, let's say, traitors to the mathematical cause. In fact, so this is for the next generation. For Borel's generation, obviously, the question. There was the political aspect you mentioned. Obviously, not all the mathematicians were leftists, were radical socialists. So there was a political opposition. But there was also. There were doubts about the use of science, scientific approach, and when you see what I said about Bergson, for instance, Bergson represents currents of intellectuals who had this kind of hostility. Well, a kind of hostility to modernity, in fact, and they couldn't accept that the thing which was at the core of Borel's interpretation of science, of the use of mathematics and of probability, that the most important thing for the citizen is to have a tool, a scientific tool, to measure risk. In modern society, the most important thing is to have a scientific tool to measure risk. And this, some currents, and someone like Bergson, for instance, was opposed to this vision of society. For him, he has a very elitarian vision of society, and the society. A really well-organized society must be directed by elite, and the question, this question of let's say, general education of citizens is democratic approach to society was not really the point. So this is another answer. But there is also a third point, maybe. The one, at least at the beginning of his career, there is something I didn't mention at all in my talk. Mention everything related to this turn of Borel towards probability. Nowadays, today. I mean, if a mathematician, I think so. If a mathematician turns to probability, there is no problem. I mean, it's accepted. Probability is accepted as a field, as a subfield of mathematics, as any other field. So it's quite common, maybe not common, but it's not so rare that, I don't know, an algebraist or a specialist of function theory at one moment has interest towards probability. So now, nowadays, I think it's obvious that probability theory is part of mathematics. But when Borel turned to probability, that was not the case at all, and overall in France, in fact. The situation in France for probability was the worst possible in all the world. Probability theory was much more developed in other places, like Germany, like Great Britain, like also Russia, for instance, or Scandinavia. In France, the situation was quite particular. There was, I spoke about the ostracism, the anti-German ostracism. There was an anti-probabilistic ostracism. And there are precise reasons in France why it was the case. Because at first glance, it may seem surprising, because at the beginning of the 19th century, obviously, the most influent probabilist in the world was French. It was Laplace, obviously. Laplace was the founder of modern probability at the beginning of the 19th century. And Laplace was a kind of center of attention at the beginning of the 19th century. So it's a bit surprising at first glance that it was not an inheritance of Laplace influence that to see probability very not only accepted but even developed in France. But after Laplace, something happened, and something happened with the major and favored disciple of Laplace, namely Poisson. So Poisson was followed Laplace path. He was his preferred disciple, and he made, as you know, he made some studies in probability, and he published in 1837 let's say an unfortunate book, which is called Remarques sur la probabilité des jugements, namely a book about the probability of the judicial matters. The idea of he followed, in fact, an idea which was developed earlier in France during the Revolution, just before the Revolution, by Condorcet, for instance, but also by Laplace, that it could be possible to use scientific methods to assure the equality of the judicial situation in all the tribunals. These people, like Condorcet, for instance, observed that there was great discrepancy between tribunals. So for someone who is accused of something, it can result in a very different conclusion if he's judged in one place or in another. And in the vision of the Enlightenment and of the Revolution, it was unacceptable. I mean, the Republic had this idea that everyone, this was a big difference that the Republic wanted to highlight between the great difference with the old regime, the monarchical regime, that with the Republic, the law is equal for everyone. So someone who is judged in a place must be treated exactly as he would be in another place. And so they developed a method, let's say, a method to test the equality of tribunals. I don't enter the technicalities here, but then so Poisson published. Laplace already had published things in that direction, but Laplace was untouchable. I mean, Laplace was a kind of statue of the commander, and so no one would say anything to Laplace. But it was not the same thing with Poisson. And so when Poisson published his book in 1837, where there are pages explaining, in fact, explaining how you have to use this method in order to judge, really, it's a practical method to be used to compare the judicial results in various tribunals. This provoked a scandal, in fact, a scandal in the French Academy of Science, and there are very famous exclamations from the philosophers who protested this unacceptable desire of mathematicians to enter the moral aspect of life and to dictate to contradict the liberty of man. Well, there are many. A philosopher like Victor Cousin, for instance, was very eager to explain this. And in fact, the consequence, it may seem strange, say like that, but it was a direct consequence of that, is that probability theory was attached with a bad reputation, in fact, a reputation of not being very serious, in fact. And a direct proof of that is that Poisson asked for the creation, at the beginning of the 19th century, the university was organized by Napoleon. I mean, the modern French university was organized along the Napoleonic model with the creation of chairs. And so several chairs were created. And Poisson asks, in the 1830s, he asked for the creation of two chairs. One chair of calculus probability and one chair of mathematical physics. And in fact, the result of this bad reputation was the creation of just one chair. One chair, which is called calculus of probabilities and mathematical physics. And this was clear from the beginning that mathematical physics was added precisely to counteract the bad reputation of the calculus of probability. And for instance, one major occupant of the chair later, Henri Poincaré, this chair of calculus of probability and mathematical physics was the first academic position of Henri Poincaré. And in fact, Henri Poincaré, during his presence on the chair, Henri Poincaré, when he signed his papers, he signed every time Henri Poincaré, Professor de Physique Mathématique. The calculus probability was never mentioned. It was only mentioned at the very end. In fact, and he never taught the calculus probability Poincaré, except at the very end of his presence. So, in fact, when Borel entered the game, let's say that a serious mathematician was not to commit himself in such a not serious task. In fact, the calculus of probability was, at the best, it was something which gave some tools for physics, namely the law of errors, which was obviously said at the very beginning that it's probability. It's useful to teach probability and for a student to learn probability because it's amusing. It's amusing. It's amusing and also clever. I mean, so there are clever methods and so on, but it's not very serious. So when Borel faced that, it's true, it was just preceded by Henri Poincaré. Henri Poincaré had an ambiguous attitude towards probability. At the beginning, he resolutely didn't want to accept it. He didn't want to accept it. He was someone educated in determinism. I mean, he was an heir of Newton, Laplace, Hamilton physics. So for him, the world was a deterministic world. But this development of statistical physics eventually obliged him to accept a part of probability. And so his task was to circumvent, in fact, this part, to explain where exactly it was reasonable for a mathematician, for a scientist, to use probability. So in a way, it's true that Poincaré accepted probability. He made some studies in probability, but at the limit, let's say, Poincaré remained a determinist. And so Borel was the first to have a step forward, a decisive step forward, and to accept probability at the core of science. So I think it's here, just to end the answer to your question, it's here in this scientific position that Borel proved very, very brave. Because Borel obviously was seen as a young star of mathematics. He was a rocket scientist. I mean, he obtained position very, very early and so on. So he was a champion of French science, of French mathematics, and his colleagues were just horrified. Well, they just thought that he was just mad. I mean, to commit himself, or just maybe it's better to put it like that. They thought that yes, he was for him. They thought that for him probability was an amusing thing. So as he was someone very curious and also very eager to disseminate mathematical results, simple mathematical results to the general audience, well, probability would be a perfect thing for that. But it's not serious. And here he was really brave, and this explained why he put this enormous, I think it is in his exhibition, this enormous energy to obtain that.
Thank you very much.
Hi. You showed us today several examples of famous mathematicians and scientists with some involvement in politics. For instance, a lot of French. You showed, for instance, Victor Voltaire, that was Italian, but the majority were French. And even recently, Cédric Villani had an important position in French politics. I don't know, a deputy or something like
yes,
this.
he was deputy.
When this transition began in France, because I don't know, there are a lot of examples of scientists, top scientists in politics, and I want to know also how do you see the importance of the participation of the scientists in the real politics, and for instance for the appreciation of science, for the acceptation for the population, for the budget, for the grants, something like that.
Well, obviously this is a complicated question because well, there are several aspects of what you mean by politics, by to be a politician, and so on. So I can't give a full answer to the deserve a full study. I mean, maybe some studies this I'm no one in mind now. But, well, I mentioned a period which was very curious, which is the empire, the first empire, Napoleonic Empire, consulate and empire, because it was certainly the period in history, at least the history of Europe, when mathematicians were closer to the power. It's quite impressive to see that. More so, another aspect. I think is very typical, and Borel is an example of this aspect. It is a situation in the Third Republic at the beginning of the 20th century. Because, as I said quickly, because it was not my topic, that a complete generation of intellectuals, in front, even the word intellectual, were forged at this moment. So a complete generation was born during the Dreyfus affair, in fact, in the 1890s. It was something enormous, I mean in France, which really divided France into two camps. And so many, and this is what I said, the word itself, intellectual, was forged at this moment to describe these people whose job is to think, let's say, and in particular academics, for instance, who wants to be involved in the politics. This was very typical. There is one famous book published by a journalist in the 1920s describing the political situation in France of the Third Republic at the beginning of the 20th century, which is called La République des Professeurs, Professors' Republic. And so I think this was a very typical moment when scientists, mathematicians in particular, were close to power. For instance, in the next generation, typically the Bourbaki generation, it was not so clear that they were involved. And maybe it's not exactly the same thing, but maybe if you go forward and you go up to the 1960s, then you find again people involved, but then in a special aspect, which is the reform of teaching, and typically the modern mathematics reform. Then you find mathematicians involved. I don't think there is a general attraction for involvement of mathematicians, but I think there's some periods when there are occasions of being involved. So I would say.
Mais alguém?
Well, thank you, Laurent, for the conference. I was wondering if you could develop a little more, not too much, but okay, a little more, the one part of the exhibition which talks about the teaching of mathematics. So Borel's involvement with the teaching for secondary schools, yeah. And so I think this would
it was obviously one very well, and as you say, it is one aspect which is developed in the exhibition. It was very important aspect for Borel, and maybe the first direction in which he wished to have a political role. To have a political influence, political action. The reason is quite obvious, meaning that, as I said several times, Borel belonged to this. There's one thing I didn't say about Borel, that he was from a Protestant family. His father was a pastor of Saint-Afrique, in fact, the town, his native town, which he became mayor after. And the Protestants played a great role in the Third Republic for obvious reasons. It was in particular the Third Republic was settled just after the Second Empire, the Second Empire which was crushed during the war with Prussia in 1870. And the Second Empire was quite well. The connection with the church was quite huge, and obviously it was an official religion, the Catholic religion, and so on. And when the Republic was settled, not immediately, but after a while, it became clearly an anti-clerical republic, and in which some minorities played an important role, typically Protestants, Jews, and Freemasons, and so on. And that was well, as you know, for Protestants, the question of education is very important. Of personal education is something very important, because when you are a Protestant, your first task, your first duty is to read the Bible. So from the Reformation time, the education was seen in Protestant families as a major duty. So the connection at the beginning of the Third Republic, because between this Protestant aspiration, let's say, and the question of education, of the extension of the Enlightenment movement, was rather obvious. So this is how Borel was educated, and so obviously when he became himself a professor, he was very eager he was convinced that the first important thing to improve the society was to educate, to give people to have a good education. And as he was a mathematician, he was convinced of the importance of mathematics, and so his natural desire was to improve the mathematical education for the citizens, for children. And precisely in this movement, so after the Dreyfus affair, there was a kind of radical change of governance. And at the beginning of the 20th century, the radical socialists came to power. It was, for instance, the law of separation between church and state was settled in 1905 in France by this radical socialist government. And during all this period was also settled a great reformation of the studies, in fact, of school studies. And was founded an institution called the Musée Pédagogique, Pedagogical Museum, but, which was not a museum at all, as we understand now. It was a museum in the Greek meaning of the word, meaning a place where things are discussed. And so that was a place where were discussed reforms of education, and they organized conferences, talks, and Borel was a great participant to this talk. He wrote a very important talk about the question of the reform of the mathematical education. And but he was not. Borel was a man of action. I mean, he was not just a thinker. So for him, it was important to understand how it was possible to implement his ideas. And an implementation would be, for instance, to write textbook for schools, for not advanced pupils. I mean, in the spirit he imagined necessary. He was he had quite a visionary opinion of the evolution. He proposed things which were implemented much later. In fact, like laboratories of mathematics, for instance, to have children at school not receiving just an abstract teaching, just well to avoid them to hear only to swallow theorems and try to repeat them or to reject them afterwards, but to experiment, to have contact with, and also it was, for instance, he was convinced that in France the evolution, for students, for universities, the evolution created a gap between students in mathematics and students in physics, and it was a pity, in fact, and he was very eager to maintain a contact between the two disciplines. This is an example, and this is why, yes, he devoted, and until during all his life, in fact, and I speak here at the beginning of the 20th century, which is more or less the beginning of his scientific life. But during all his life, he was interested in general education. He published books of general interest. In you don't know it, but there is a famous collection which is called Que sais-je, meaning what do I know, which was a kind of small encyclopedic collection, very cheap books, which was very important on the French intellectual scene, which was created at the end of the 1930s or beginning of 1940s, and he published several volumes in this collection. He was always very eager to avoid. This was a dialogue with Tiana. You mentioned tensions. There were obviously tensions between Borel and the other mathematicians. One famous tension is with Lebesgue. Lebesgue was typically very skeptical about this use of mathematics for society, for so on and so on, and they had quite a lot of harsh dialogue between them about this question.
Mais alguém, gente? Temos tempo? Pergunta? Curiosidades? Comentários? So we have no more questions. I would like to thank you very much again, Laurent. Muito obrigada. E agora convidar todo mundo para ver, né, a exposição que está ali fora.